So thank you ever so much for joining me tonight for this webinar. Believe it or not, this is one of my favourite subjects, recruitment and retention in the voluntary sector. And it certainly isn't because it's easy. I'm sure you've all found that whether you've been recruiting paid staff or volunteers, there are lots and lots of challenges around that. And what I'm hoping to do is give you some tips on how to get the best people to help you support your organisation, whether they're paid members of staff or volunteers, and once you've got them to be able to keep them. And that's taking into account the fact that often you're really small organisations, you don't have a huge CPD budget, you don't have a huge career progression, and yet the likelihood is that what you attract to your organisation are people that are really, really passionate about the things that are passionate to you. So I'm hoping today to give you a few tips that will help you. I think the first thing to say is, why is recruitment and retention so important? Recruitment is important because as your organisation grows or it develops or you bring new projects online, the likelihood is that you're going to have to bring new people in with new skills. It may be that you don't have the skills within the organisation to deliver on particular pieces of work, and therefore you're really going out to the market to find people who share your passion for that organisation but are also looking for paid work. In terms of volunteers, many community organisations rely on volunteers, and that in itself is a real challenge, because actually there are lots of volunteering opportunities. People can pick and choose where they want to volunteer and how much time they want to give and where they want to share their skills. So even volunteering is a very competitive field. Retention of staff and retention of volunteers, I'm sure you'll all know, is absolutely crucial. If you get those people that grow with you, that understand your organisation, that you can rely on and that you can trust, you want to keep them. So we're looking at recruitment and retention alongside in this webinar. It doesn't matter whether you've got community buildings, minibuses, a forest, your greatest asset is always going to be your staff and volunteers, because without them you can't deliver. It's no good having a minibus if you haven't got drivers. It's no good having a building if you haven't got people who can actually run it. But there are a number of challenges that have meant that recruitment into the third sector at the moment is as challenging as it's ever been. The first one is the cost of living crisis, and that means that people are leaving the voluntary sector for better pay. Inevitably, voluntary sector has always struggled to be able to deliver significant wages and job security because of the limitations of funding. And the sad fact is that often there are now unskilled jobs or semi-skilled jobs that can attract a greater pay than what we're delivering in the voluntary sector. And while some people will really continue to want to work with people and for passion, they may have to make a decision based on finances. Burnout is a particularly critical factor within the voluntary sector, particularly in social care, and this means that retaining staff is more difficult. If you support people in crisis, if you support people with complex needs, then staff who are exposed to that and trying to support that day in, day out really need a level of support to avoid burnout. Things like non-managerial supervision, clinical supervision. And I would say if you operate in that arena, if you work with people with complex needs or people that face trauma, then when you're putting your funding bids in, put in for things like clinical supervision and non-managerial supervision, because otherwise, burnout is one of the biggest reasons that people leave social care. Small organisations often have limited opportunities for CPD and to progress through the organisation. And I think we've all seen, young or maybe not so young people coming into the organisation who are wanting a career, but in order to progress, they have to leave. And that is because that that career structure doesn't exist within the organisation, and that's a real challenge, because you see people, you want them to grow in the organisation, but there are limited opportunities for you to do that, and that in itself presents a real threat. So I'm not painting a particularly optimistic picture of recruitment and retention in the third sector, but there are, we continue to be a creative sector that looks for solutions to these problems, and I'm hoping to share some of those with you. If we start with recruitment, in addition to being responsible for recruiting to a number of senior roles within the third sector, I also run a website called Charity Job Finder. Charity Job Finder is based in Wales, and we recruit exclusively to the charity sector. And one of the things that we see over and over again is poorly written job adverts and poorly written job descriptions and person specifications and lack of clarity on benefits. And people put their advert out and they either get little or no response, or people download the job description and then they look at it and say, well, hang on a minute, this is not reasonable, I can't do this in this amount of time. So one of the things that I would say to all organisations, if you're recruiting, is to look at your job advert from the perspective of somebody looking for either a job or a volunteering placement. And does it appeal to you? Do you use exclusionary language? Use the tone and pitch. We had an example where someone was wanting someone to work part-time for the organisation, and they would be doing outreach, and therefore it was quite reasonable that they would have a mobile phone that would be supplied by the organisation, so that they could contact and make appointments. And in big letters on the applications form, it said, on the job description, it said, for work use only. Now, you might want to say that to people once they start, but what does that communicate to you in terms of values about this organisation, that they assume you're going to run off and start using the phone inappropriately? So, look at the tone and the pitch, read the advert, read the role description as a job seeker, and would it appeal to you? Really friendly things, come and join our team, this is what we're about, this is where our passion lies. They make all the difference. People who are looking at third sector jobs are not looking at it because they want to be a millionaire. They're looking at it because it's something that they feel passionate about, and therefore share and communicate that passion both in your advert but also in your role descriptions. The other thing that a lot of people struggle with is that they try and put everything into the person specification. The record that I've seen is an 11-page job description and person specification for a part-time role. And I'm afraid I just went back and said, you haven't got a hope with this. You need to look at this. Let's look at this again. And what this organisation was doing, you can see it as logical, said, well, we don't have many staff, so we've put everything into the role description that no one else is doing, like a coverall. Well, that might sound rational from the point of view of trying to get everything done, but if you're coming into an organisation and you want to be attractive for your skills, and you suddenly realise that there's this whole raft of other things that you're going to be expected to do, you're going to be put off by that. And in terms of benefits, this is something that comes up a lot. It's unlikely that you're able to provide huge salaries, but do you have a pension? Do you give people a day off when it's their holiday? Do you have team building things? Do you have discount opportunities at different stores, those kind of things? People are really interested in benefits, and they might be quite creative benefits. So just because it hasn't got a huge salary with it, if you're able to say, do you know what, but we provide these other things for you. You know, in terms of if you can get any CPD and job shadowing and progress within the organisation, then those are the things that will, again, enhance that advert. And what I would say to you, you know, if you, you know, after the webinar, if you want to look at the case study, one of the things to do is actually go back and look at one of your adverts, and again, look at it from the perspective of somebody looking for a role. Did it clearly communicate what that made that role and that organisation special? We know at Charity Job Finder that there are certain organisations where when they advertise roles, they will get a lot of interest. And the reason that they get a lot of interest is that it's a highly valued organisation. And part of that is being public, is being visible. So looking at, you know, not only advertising the job, but advertising yourself, your organisation, is really, really important. In terms of attracting a diverse range of candidates, a lot of people say, well, we don't have any money for recruitment, and therefore we're just going to advertise on our Facebook. And, you know, the particular challenges of the island is that there are large areas of the island that are really rural, so you're already fishing in a really small pool, and if you only go out to those people who already know you, you're shrinking and shrinking and shrinking that pool. So you need to think, if there are specific skills that you need, where are those people? Where are the people that would be attracted to this role? And how do we advertise that? And obviously there are sites such as ours, Charity Job Finder, but also advertising on local radio. You know, there are lots of local radio stations that will put out adverts for free for you. So remember, the bigger the pool, the more likely you are that you're going to get a diverse number of candidates. It's really useful to monitor the number of people that request a job pack from you. You can do that either through a website that monitors that kind of thing, or if you ask people to send in their CV or request the job pad from you, and then they don't send the application form in. We would often say to you, ask them, why is it that you didn't fill the application form in? Can you tell us why? Because that gives you really valuable feedback for next time. And people rarely do that. So ask them, you know, you applied. Sometimes it might be I ran out of time, or I forgot about it, or whatever, but it may be that they've got some really valuable feedback for you. So proper recruitment, and you reflect your costs for recruitment in your funding bids. If you're applying for a post, you should also be applying for CPD for that post. You should also be applying for the recruitment costs to be able to do that properly. CPD is, it's completely gone, professional development. It's continuous professional development, and CPD is where you have access to training, where you have access to growth within the organisation. So CPD is continuous professional development, and organisations, lots of recruiters will look for that, and it's what it says is, our organisation is investing in my development. Now, if you're a huge organisation, you probably turn around to all the staff and say, right, you've got £3,000 a year to have training. Small voluntary and community organisations don't have that. So how would you train? How would you train and grow people in the organisation? And that might be things like shadowing. Will allow you, you know, a certain amount of time to shadow. We might allow you to go off and work with another organisation, maybe for 3 days, to see what they do and come back and learn. So lots of creative ways to do provide CPD without having to spend a lot of money. You've got people that are actively looking for roles, but I would imagine that most of the people that are applying for jobs are not necessarily saying, I need to get something and I need to get something now. What they're doing is they're casting around for something better than they're already doing. And they're what we call passive job seekers. And to get them You really need to spark their interest. And one of the ways to do that is to spark interest in your organisation. A number of times when we've been involved in recruitment for specific organisations, we've created interviews with beneficiaries. What is it like to be part of this organisation and how does it impact you? Interviews with staff, a day in the life of what is it like to be here. And that's also important if you're trying to recruit volunteers, because one of the big fears that volunteers have is that they're going to be subsumed into this organisation and they're going to be asked to give more time than they would reasonably want to do. So again, videos showing volunteers saying, this is why I come and volunteer, this is what I get out of it, are all great ways of giving people an insight. And they're really useful for, passive job seekers who are potentially just looking on social media and seeing what's out there. So employer branding is really, really important. Be the organisation that everyone wants to work for. So again, if you were, after the webinar, if you wanted to have a look at the case study and you wanted an activity for you to undertake to be able to cement what I'm saying and think about it and how it applies to your own role, then think about, where do we currently recruit? Where do we look for volunteers? Where do we look for paid staff? Are you exploring new avenues? And do you get the potential applicants? Do they get a sense of the culture of your organisation before they apply? Are they excited about applying to you? So again, there are lots of opportunities to advertise in different areas and through outreach and staff videos and testimonials. So really putting together a campaign. If you're wanting to recruit people, it's more than just putting an advert out and a job description, a person specification. It's about being able to generate a buzz, to generate interest in your organisation prior to that happening. So we've talked about recruitment. I want to talk about retention now. And again, I think some of the things that I discussed early on in this webinar around retention are particularly critical if you are a smaller organisation or you're an organisation that supports people with really complex needs or crisis support. The top reasons for staff turnover are low pay and financial pressures, job insecurity, which I want to talk about, burnout and stress, lack of hybrid opportunities. COVID provided us with opportunities to work from home, and people quite liked it. And therefore, a lot of people now want to do that. Whereas a lot of third sector jobs, you need to be there. You're dealing with people. You need to be face to face. And that can make it a slightly less attractive role than it would be for people who are able to do a hybrid role. The importance of career progression and skills development, and why people have to leave in order to grow. One of the things that I would talk about in terms of job insecurity, the majority of third sector obviously is project funded. So you might get funding for 2 years or 3 years, or even if you're lucky 5 years. Sometimes it's less. And when people go out to advert and they say, this job's for 2 years, thinking about it from the perspective of a job seeker, if you're in a job that's got 3 years to run, are you really going to move into a job that has less job security than you already have, particularly given the current climate? And what I would say is, if you are committed, if you're starting with a project but you're committed to keeping that going, then you can use the term, initially fixed term but permanent subject to funding, and you can use that term. But what that says is, we are committed to getting ongoing funding, and that changes the shape of that and the attractiveness of that job for people that are looking for more job security. And also, when you are looking for funding, when you are looking to to continue with funding for a project, then you really should be looking at it at what point should we be looking for continuous funding? Because otherwise you will lose people, because people think, gosh, there's only 6 more months to go and they haven't got any future funding. I need to start looking elsewhere. And an engaging work culture. The work doesn't have to be easy. The work doesn't have to be easy, but what it does need to be is meaningful, and people need to feel supported and engaged. And people will stay in an organisation because they like working there. And that is really, really important. And for managers, it's a real challenge, because if you're feeling really stressed, the last thing that you want to do is start running around being all happy clappy with everyone and saying, how are you? But it's essential. And people that feel that they're part of a team, that they're part of something that's delivering on a collective value, can keep staff. So, thinking about your work culture, is it a blame culture? Is it a culture where people feel unsupported, or, people go off sick and no one contacts them and says, are you okay? Can we help? So culture's a really, really important one. Big piece of work, but it's really, really important. So again, after the webinar, if you wanted to look at this from an interactive point of view and say, how do I reflect, and how do I look at that learning in relation to my own organisation, and make sure that I'm doing things that are valuable to keep people, is to think about your staff turnover in the last 2 years and what were the main reasons that people leave. This is why exit interviews are so important. And ask people to be honest. Sometimes people don't want to leave, but they've seen no signs at all that you're going to provide continuous funding, or they want to grow, or they want career progression. So ask people on exit interviews, when new recruits start, do they get the support they need? And again, in a highly pressured organisation, you're kind of expecting people to hit the ground running, but you're not going to get the best out of them if you don't provide a proper induction, if you don't provide mentoring so that they're able to feel part of the team as quick as possible. And then again, in terms of progression, if you don't have significant career progression opportunities, think of non-traditional ways that you can grow people in your organisation. So training, secondment, providing them with additional responsibilities, allowing them to work shadow other organisations and other staff within your organisation to see what that's about. And a lot of people say, well, I don't want to grow them because if I grow them, they'll leave. If I start giving them all this leadership experience and broadening their skills, they're going to be attractive to other people. They're going to leave anyway. They're going to leave anyway if they don't feel that their needs have been met in the organisation. But actually you're getting more out of them, so that even if they do leave, if you've invested in people feel a lot more loyal to you, but also you're getting more out of them because you're giving them opportunities to grow in the organisation, just not outside it. And mentoring and peer mentoring is a real win-win. So if you get staff to peer mentor, there's benefits for the mentor and there's benefits for the mentee. And in some organisations, it's a mutual thing, so that people mentor each other. And there's lots and lots of support around that, but everybody benefits from that. And it's a significant way to reduce burnout, because people are often reluctant to say to line managers, I'm struggling, because the perception is if I'm struggling, somebody's going to think I can't do my job. Whereas if there's an opportunity for them to talk to someone else in the organisation, that is not part of the line management structure, then that can be really powerful. Well-being and burnout. Well-being and burnout is a significant issue within organisations, and believe it or not, it applies to volunteers as well as it does paid staff. Because good volunteers are also really, really committed to your organisation. They are really committed to what you do and the trials and tribulations of that. And we often rely really heavily on volunteers. So why is it such a risk in voluntary and community organisations? Well, there's a number of reasons. The first is chronic underfunding leads to small teams doing the work of larger ones. And I'm yet to find anybody who doesn't do extra stuff that's not really in their job description because it needs doing, and because you haven't got anyone in that role, or because the volunteer who normally does it is off sick or has got caring responsibilities. So what you find is that employees and volunteers take on multiple roles that are often outside their job descriptions. And whilst you can look at that and say, well, isn't that great? You know, we're all pulling as a team. We all know that it causes real anxiety. If you're being asked to do something that you're not confident in doing, that causes real anxiety and can cause burnout as well if you find that people are ramping up lots and lots of extra hours, or people are reluctant to take time off in lieu because they say, well, I can't be off because if I'm off, then who's going to do my job? And even warning signs such as people saying, well, I can't take annual leave, or I don't have a lunch break. These are all really bad signs that boundaries are being crossed and you're going to have burnout. So it's really important for managers and board members to say, do you know, how are our staff and how are our volunteers? And what are we doing to make sure that they get proper care and they are properly supported and we're not expecting too much of them? Staff shortages, particularly in medium-sized organisations, mean individuals are frequently covering for unfulfilled positions. And the challenge there is that if you think you're just about muddling on with the staff that you're doing, you can save that money. And it's a really short-term win. Because if people are doing 2 jobs and they're paid for one, or they are employed to do 1 job, those 2 jobs are not getting done properly, and it's having an impact on those individuals. So whilst we do it in the short term, it's something you need to be really mindful of and say, this is not sustainable. It's not sustainable. We should not be ploughing that onto people's backs. And the other thing that I would say, and again, dealing with people with complex needs, people with in a social care setting such as domestic abuse, is vicarious trauma. I'm not sure whether you've ever come across vicarious trauma, but vicarious trauma is really when support workers or people that engage directly with people with complex needs have empathy overload and start experiencing the trauma of their clients or their beneficiaries firsthand. And it wipes you out. It's very, very dangerous. Vicarious trauma is very, very dangerous, and it's something that comes as an aggregate. It builds up and it builds up. If you are working with vulnerable people, then I would definitely suggest look into vicarious trauma and trauma overload, and look for ways in which you can say to your staff team, you know, is everyone all right? Clinical supervision is really great if you can get that put in. There are often courses, if you look at some of the universities that deliver, you know, counselling qualifications and counselling degrees, a significant part of that course will be that they have to make up voluntary counselling hours. And if you can find people who are students, they will be supervised. They're great to do group clinical supervision or non-managerial supervision and do it for free. It helps them and it helps you, but don't ignore it, because this is when people go off with stress and you can't get them back. Grim, eh? But you know, people care. You're not going to come into this kind of work if you don't care, but you have to be able to protect people. I think that's what I'm saying. You can't drink from an empty cup, I think the saying was. So what are the kind of strategies? Well, we've talked a little bit about vicarious trauma and things like that. Promoting a healthy work-life balance. If you create a culture in your organization that it's great to overwork, it's great to work late, it's great to do lots of hours over your normal hours, you're on a hiding to nothing. The culture should be, you come to work, you do a great job, then you go home and relax. That's what the culture, and that's how you will keep people, and that's how you'll get people coming back to work fresh again. So this expectation, and it becomes a culture. If you have people that work over and over and over, people coming in, there's an implicit expectation that they'll do the same, and that's just not healthy at all. Build a supportive leadership and management culture. So regular support and supervision with the emphasis on support. How are you doing? You know, how are things? Is there anything not working well at the moment? You know, people say, well, I don't want to ask that because they might tell me. Well, if they don't tell you, you'll find out soon enough, because the quality of their work and their engagement will drop. Provide mental health and emotional well-being support. And again, you know, engaging with the universities. I think Bangor University do a counselling qualification. They may well be looking for people who can have placements where they can be doing you know, clinical supervision and things like that, and they are all supervised. Make flexible and hybrid working as far as possible the norm. And I appreciate that if people are working with people, the likelihood is that they you know, they are needed for face-to-face. But is there a way in which you can say, okay, you have a day outreach, but you do a certain number of appointments, and then you can go home and write those up rather than coming back into the office? It makes a huge difference to people if you're able to do that. Recognise and reward staff contributions, and that doesn't always have to be financial, but you know, having, you know, bringing cakes in and things like that goes a long way. Encourage physical well-being and prevent fatigue. So I know people that do meditation at lunchtime, and they have yoga classes and things like that. So all these kind of things are great and don't cost a lot of money. Strengthen team connection and community, so that people look out for each other, that they find out, you know, what have you been up to, and make sure that they're aware when people are not doing well. Address job security and reduce uncertainty. You know, funding strategies. You have a funding strategy, and you say to people, look, we know your funding's ending in 6 months, but we're putting these bids in. We want to keep you. We want to keep this role going. It's really, really powerful. It sends a powerful message to people and will reduce loss of people. And then invest in training and professional development. There's a whole lot of free training and professional development out there. So have a look for that, because that can be really beneficial. Again, just quickly, you know, the case study that comes with the webinar, if you the kinds of things that the case study did here were produced regular well-being check-ins to assess staff and assess stress levels. And again, sometimes this needs to be done without the line management structure, because people are more likely to be able to be honest and say how they're feeling. Flexible working options, and then mental health first aid training, you know, those kind of things. Having staff members who invest in other people gives a real signal: we care about you, we know you do a great job, and we want to look after you. So some great reflection for you to do there. And again, just thinking about your own organisation and how you currently support staff wellbeing. Do you have formal policies to protect against burnout? You know, having that conversation at a staff meeting, you know, how do we deal with that? Should we be doing something else? And ask staff to come up with some solutions for this kind of thing. And do leaders check in with staff about their stress levels? And the action, if you wanted to do this again as an interactive session after the webinar, is to identify one well-being initiative that you could introduce into the organisation, and just monitor how it goes. See what the take-up is like. See how people engage with it, and whether they feel that that's valuable. And then, my final thoughts, and we'll take questions after the webinar's completed. But it's easier to keep staff than recruit them, especially in today's environment. So I would say to you, look at ways to be able to demonstrate to your staff that you value them, that you want them to grow in the organisation, that you care about their well-being. With limited resources, you need to be creative, but there are lots of opportunities to do things like that. It might be, talking to local businesses and saying, look, maybe local hotels and things like that, can we, would you do a sponsorship package? Can we have a staff raffle, things like that. Recruitment requires investment, so doing it on the cheap is a really limited way. You might strike it lucky. There might be somebody on Facebook that's perfect for your organisation, but remember, the bigger the pool, the more diversity, the more likely you are to going to get somebody with the right skills. Develop people in your organisation rather than having to leave to get along, and develop everyone above their role. So that's concludes the webinar.